Hey, Toby, and hey, everybody else. Welcome to the second video on Gamer Book Club. It's taken this long. Sorry about the delay, but I'm so happy to have you. So far in Gamer Book Club history, we just have one episode of us talking about Mega Man X, but here we are in our second video talking about an auxiliary topic. Toby and I, here today, no video, are going to be talking about the greatest years in gaming history. So, not on Gamer Book Club. I know it sounds like we're just going to play games, but we're going to talk and have casual discussions too, and that's what this is. That actual episode 2 will be coming out soon. It's going to be on Luigi's Mansion, so look forward to that. It's not far off the pipeline, and we'll see what comes after that. But this is our second video, and it's going to be just Toby and I here. Toby played Mega Man X with me in our first episode, along with Joe. Joe's not here today. It's just me and Toby, and I'm only going over that just because there's no video. Say hi, Toby. How's it going?
Hey, what's up? Guess we're just here to talk about what we consider to be the best years in gaming. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
Oh hell yeah! So, going at this just topic generally, introing it is, do you get involved in like the end of the year? Do you personally think like what was my favorite game that year? By the end of each year, do you start to have those kind of conversations, or is it just like the Game Awards conversations that you actually start thinking about that? Like, is this something that matters to you, or do you not even really think about it much?
I mean, I always think it's fun to think about it. Admittedly, I'm not the best when it comes to playing games right as they release. So, like when it comes to 2022, for example, I didn't play like a majority of the games that came out that year. So, I guess it's hard to say, like, oh, well, what's my favorite game of 2022, for example. But,
yeah.
I mean, I always think the Game Awards like fun to watch just for like fun. Obviously, I don't take them too seriously. It's like all of just our own opinions and such at the end of the day. So, just fun discussion for the most part. So,
yeah, I get more value out of it in a retrospective way because I too do not really play games that much in the year they come out. It's just like a money thing, but also I'm playing other stuff. Like, I don't feel the need most of the time that like just because something came out that I'm like, well, I have to play it. Only if I'm really excited about it. Like, for example, like when Metroid Dread came out, I was like, I gotta play that the day it comes out. Whenever Tears of the Kingdom comes out, I'm gonna play that the day it comes out. I need to be especially excited or be such a big fan of the series that's like can't miss for me. But if it's one of those games that it's not in a series, or maybe I'm only mildly excited, I'm not going to jump out of my seat to go and buy it. I'm going to most likely wait for it to go on sale. I might play it years later because it doesn't matter when you play it. Just have a good time and play it when you want to. Everybody has their own backlog to go through. So.
Yeah, I was about to mention I have plenty of games in my backlog, so yeah.
Yeah, and because of that, it's fun to look at what were the greatest games to come out, or if a year had a especially great pairing or lineup of great games that year. Well, it's fun to kind of call it out and be like, was that like an especially special year in gaming? Was there something different about it? Like, how come all of these heavy hitters came out that year versus another year where it was just average? Like, it feels like every now and then, like, you're going through, like, this is one of those years. Like, it's a special year. It only happens maybe once or twice a decade where you're like, all right, this is one of those years where, a game that maybe was only the 4th or 5th best game of the year could have been a game of the year any other year. Like, I feel like there's some years where that's happened, where games get overshadowed just because everything was so good that year. And we'll get into when that's happened, but you can relate with that, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely.
So we're just going to, what we're going to do here is, you see that we have a Google Sheet. We kind of just like went through, and obviously it's a lot more populated after a certain point in time, but we kind of just listed a bunch of years in chronological order and games that struck us that came out in that time frame. And we wanted to talk about it and be like, what games came out that year that were especially interesting, and is this one unique? What are the heavy hitters, and which are our basically favorite games that came out in that year that make our favorite years in gaming history? It literally says game of the year by year. this isn't just listing games that were the game of the year. Some of these might not have even been popular the year they came out, but they had, a retrospective cult following or any of those number of things. But we just wanted to go over and maybe by the end even kind of bracket it out and try to seed and make a top 8 or so, and kind of really get this going and see what was the best year in gaming history, just in like a retrospective way. Obviously, it's going to be subjective. We're going to try to be objective about things, but there are obviously going to be, our own opinions that get involved in this. But I always have a good time thinking about this kind of stuff, and yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Is there anything you want to say before we just start going year by year, Toby?
I mean, you already mentioned it, but obviously, these are just our opinions, so don't take it too seriously. We're not saying like, oh, if we say this year's the best year, then like we're not saying it's objectively the best year. It's just like what we personally felt was the best year. So, don't.
Yeah, and I think you and I, Toby, have similar tastes, but certainly not identical. So, we'll come to a head on that as we go through this. So, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, so when we start in 1983, that's before even the birth of the NES. Like, we have the NES here in 1985, and as I mentioned, this is going to get more populated after 1997. I think this is when the advent, and obviously Nintendo Power probably, the video game magazines and video game media started to get more. People started to really play games as like their passion, their lifestyle, something that they really did in the early 90s. But I'd say like when that bubble was really, really building up and getting big, is probably the dawn of the 3D era, when it's a lot easier to track these sort of things. And Toby and I, we were born in the mid 90s, so it's going to be easier for us to go over the games that came out past that time, and there's just a lot more to talk about because games were more readily available. Games were more widely covered. There was more media on it. There was magazines. There was video game reviews on TV. There was video game reviews on YouTube after a certain point, and there was Let's Plays and all that kind of stuff. But when we're talking about 1983 up to the early 90s, these are people were playing these games and having these conversations in living rooms with their friends and in the school bus and at the lunchrooms at school, and it's harder to have as much of a historical footprint on those conversations for us, especially because we weren't there, but also because they weren't recorded as much as what we see now. I mean, after a certain point, you can go on the internet and read people's forum posts about their experience with these games as they came out, and even read text-based reviews of the years these games came out. So that's the reason things are a little more slim in this earlier era. You're right on the same page with that, right, Toby?
Yeah, pretty much. I think you nailed it on the head perfectly. So
awesome. So that's why when we go to 1983, we have Mario Bros. So I think talking about 1983, there's one thing that comes to my mind. Is there anything that comes to your mind about 1983?
Well, was that around the video game crash? I can't remember exactly.
The video game crash of 1983.
All right.
So 1983 is one of those years in gaming. I mean, that's the infamous year where home console video gaming, quote unquote, crashed because of E.T. on the Atari 2600. Mm-hmm. I believe it came out in 1982, December 1982. Yeah. So at that point, people. That's the story. I wasn't there, but I imagine there became a lack of trust in buying these games that looked so different than what you were actually buying. Like in the NES days, whenever the NES first came out, there was the black box. There was the black box NES games, and if you remember these, Nintendo wasn't trying to lie to you about what these games looked like. Maybe this isn't the best image, but they showed you exactly what the game looked like on the box art. So there's no doubt about what you're getting into. That's what Urban Champion looks like. This is what Super Mario Bros. Looks like. This is what Donkey Kong Jr. Math looked like. There was more of an honesty about it. And whenever we go into the Atari days, they're, you know, the games were more primitive. They're trying to, you know, sell you on this fantasy of what the game really looks like, because if they were to show you what the game really looks like, you're looking at very, very simple images, you know, dots, you know, and it's less interesting to sell games that way. And that's why, you know, there was that crash before Nintendo came back into the home market in 1985, and, you know, Super Mario Bros. Really changed the world again on that, in that way. But that's what it's really hard to talk about 1983 about anything else but the arcade, I would say. Is there any games for 1983 that we even could talk about as being the big hitters?
Oh, a personal favorite of mine, as you probably know, is Mappy, that apparently came out in 1983.
Oh, hell yeah, Mappy.
Yeah, that was a game that
Love Mappy.
Yeah, a game I played when I was younger, and yeah, it's a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah, it looks like Donkey Kong 3 came out in the arcade. That one's a little weird. It's like Donkey Kong 1, you play as Jumpman Mario, facing, you know, Donkey Kong going up and saving Pauline, and then Donkey Kong Jr. was Donkey Kong 2, where you played as Donkey Kong Jr., or was it? Yeah, it was Donkey Kong Jr. saving Pauline, or Donkey Kong? Yeah, it was Donkey Kong from Mario, who was the villain. And then Donkey Kong 3, you play as this, like, random guy. This guy, I don't remember his name.
Okay.
But Stanley or something? I want to say it's Stanley. I knew it. It's Stanley.
It's Stanley, yeah.
You play as Stanley, and it's just like, what? But Mappy, that's a big one. I'd say Star Wars in Atari, but that was a big game in the arcade. But basically, 1983 is going to be defined by the arcade games that are released. What you're seeing a lot here, Dragon's Lair is an iconic arcade game without a doubt. Don Bluth's animation style, and, you know, the Advent QuickTime events, but in that artistic, animated, stylized way, was really fun. Is there anything else here that we're seeing? So I've heard a lot of Spy Hunter. Elevator Action I've definitely played, which is fun. Mappy might be the one. I've played Sinistar. I think that game is iconic for that Sinistar character. I believe he speaks, and he had this intimidation factor that I enjoyed. Toby and I have been to a lot of arcade museums and been able to play these games ourselves. Not that we grew up with them. Well, I think we have a little bit of exposure, but I don't have a lot to say about what I'm seeing here, other than, you know, Dragon's Lair. If Space Ace also came out in '83, then that was a crazy year that they made both of those games, because that's the same creator. But other than that, yeah, I'm just seeing a lot of arcade classics, but I wouldn't say it's one of the years that you and I really are going to gravitate towards.
Yep, it's aside from Mappy, and I can't say I know a whole lot about these other games, so I can't speak a whole lot on them. So
yeah, and then what about 1984? I know it's a good book. I'm just joking. Obviously, what we're gonna go over here first, the ones that we stuck out to us, and Tetris. How could you not talk about Tetris? I mean, I personally think Tetris is one of the greatest games ever made.
Oh yeah, agreed. I mean, it's still great to this day.
I think it will stand the test of time forever. Just the concept, it's never going to grow old. It's always going to be something that people are entertained by and get into. I think so.
Yeah, I mean, there's still like fancy Tetris, or like variations of Tetris that we can play right now. Is Tetris 99 still a thing, for example, or?
Yeah, I would play that a little bit too.
So yeah, I mean, like this, I'd say it's probably one of the oldest games that's still like have aged well to this day. So
did Excitebike come out for the Famicom in 1984? Looks like it did. Okay, so the Famicom I think came out in 83 or 84, but yeah, it also came out in the arcades in Japan in 84. I think Excitebike's a good game, acceptable. I think it has an icon status to it, just, you know, for it being there, you know, at the beginning of when Nintendo was becoming iconic. I don't think going back to it's anything too insane, too crazy. But I think you start to see here some of the home console releases of what became a lot of those black box games that I showed earlier for Nintendo as far as coming out in America. But if I remember correctly, King's Quest is a pretty iconic point-and-click adventure game by Sierra. Do you have any... Have you ever encountered that game?
I've seen a little bit about it. Yeah, it's like, yeah, as you said, like one of the first point-and-click adventure games out there, I think. So,
yeah.
But, yeah.
Balloon Fight, was that an arcade game or also just a Famicom? Came out a lot of things. Yeah, just a Famicom game. So, yeah, we really are seeing a lot of those black box games are coming out in Japan. I think we should probably, for the sake of consistency, go off of American release dates. And did Tetris even come out in America in 1984? It probably was out in Russia for a certain period of time. Yeah, it didn't come out in America until 88 on the IBM PC, and then not long after that, the Game Boy. Because I've watched documentaries on Tetris, and from what I understand, Russia tried to keep it its own product for as long as it could, because the actual Russian government legitimately wanted credit over the creation of the game. So,
okay.
Yeah, Alexei Pajitnov worked for the Russian government, if I am not mistaken. So, yeah, Tetris was created here. If it's hard to, it didn't gain relevancy really until this era here. Would you agree?
I guess. I mean, I obviously know about Tetris, but I can't say for sure exactly what years it really started to take off. But I guess if it got released in America around like 1988, it would make sense that, that's...
Yeah, and I think it really, really burst in popularity whenever it came out on the Game Boy in 1989, whenever the Game Boy came out. So, here in 1989. So, I think this is the version that set the world on fire. And I don't know when the NES version came out, but I know that there was a lawsuit about that. There were two different versions, a 10-gen version and then a Nintendo version, and those also came out in 89. So, yeah, I'd say... Looks like Tetris for Family Computer. Yeah, so I'd say the advent of Tetris is right here, but, like, the Tetris we know and love is more this era. So I'd say 1984. As far as our taste, there's not a lot to dig into here.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I imagine this will be the case for a lot of these earlier years. So yeah.
Yeah. Let me just bucket these with red if we're not going to list them as one of our best years in gaming history. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, sure. Whatever works for you.
And then we'll bucket them as yellow if we're like, maybe, and then green if we're like, absolutely for sure, this is one of the best years of gaming history.
All right, yeah, that's fair.
So 1985, at the top of my head, I don't have to guess. I wouldn't even have to look at that and say, yeah, Super Mario Bros. That's 1985. NES, that's 1985. That is one of the most iconic years in video game history, and I don't think video gaming would be where it's at right now unless Super Mario Bros. And NES came out at that time and became the phenomenon it was, because it gave game developers across the entire world not only confidence to keep punching up and creating these new style of games that really caught people's hearts and really got them into different worlds, and wanted them just to keep playing these games and really enveloping themselves. We could be a few years behind if it took until like the 90s and until someone really came out there and made those games. The technology would have been advanced, but these gameplay and game development, game design, marvels that happened might not have happened at that time. So maybe we'd be behind. Like that's what comes to my mind. 1985. Is there anything else in 1985 that you're like that sticks out to you?
I'm not sure this is 1985 in particular, but is this like around the time where Nintendo released their that seal of approval thing to kind of promise consumers that hey, we're Nintendo, we're promising that these games are going to be like good, or like they're not going to be like whatever like crazy stuff that could appear in like any Atari game, for example.
Yeah, let me see. Nintendo seal of approval, was that what's called? Seal of quality, maybe?
Yes,
Because I don't know exactly what year that came out, but I do know that story. It's that gold seal of quality. They released that as kind of being like, this is a licensed game. Main reason for the video game crash of '83. We went over that. When did that originate? I actually don't know. I know it was during the NES era, but yeah, unlicensed Nintendo games didn't get the seal. It's not really giving us a year, but yeah, I mean, I think the admin of that wasn't far off. Oh yeah, looks like the first seal of quality used on many black box games from 1985 to 1989. The seal of assurance that Nintendo's approved and it guaranteed the quality of this product. And I mean, that was probably a good idea because I imagine the Wild Atari was more like the Wild West as far as getting games onto their console. And that's what led to the crash. Like, people were just releasing games and they could be trash, like maybe. And Nintendo had more of a rigorous approval process, from what I understand, to get games onto their system.
Oh yeah, I think you're right on the money with that. Yeah, I think literally anyone could just release a game for the Atari. So
yeah, and from what I understand, Nintendo would, not. I understand that they censored stuff, but also they would be like, yeah, this isn't quality enough, or basically they had to go through an approval process, and there was pushback against that, which led to 10-gen NES games people could make. We're making, this is actually Atari. These 10-gen, this is Atari. We're making unlicensed NES games under the nose of Nintendo, and from what I understand, it led to licensing problems, as you could imagine. But yeah, these did not have the Nintendo seal quality. They still somehow showed up in stores, and you could rent them, but these were not the norm. And I imagine some quality games probably came out of this, but they were happening under Nintendo's nose, and they were trying their best to not make this happen. From what I understand, the only unlicensed game for the Super Nintendo was Super Noah's Ark 3D, right? Where you had to put a game on top of the game to actually be able to play it, because Nintendo had a chip inside of the Super Nintendo that would automatically block licensed games. So yeah, so 1985, we're going right into the NES days. So other than a lot of those black box games, Wrecking Crew, Super Mario Bros. Gyromite, A View to a Kill, that's when the last Roger Moore James Bond movie came out. It looks like it was a ZX Spectrum game. I don't think we're in quite a banger of a year quite yet. I don't know if a lot of these development companies had caught on to the NES yet, because it was so fresh. So we're probably not even seeing a lot of games released onto that hardware yet. Other than Super Mario Bros., was there anything else that you found out?
I mean, I guess some generally good games, you could say. I think I see Ghosts and Goblins in there. That's probably Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. I'm not sure that was on the NES, or that was... I imagine that was probably on like PC or something, but...
It looks like... yeah, we have those black box games, all by Nintendo. What else was... And it looks like the NES came out in late 1985, so if we're talking about Nintendo games, the only games that came out upon release in North America were the black box Nintendo games. From what I've seen, they all came out on the same day. It looks like Nintendo just went for it all at once with their R&D departments and just released a crap ton of NES games at once, and really went hard into offering a variety for their new console to make sure that it was successful. It looks like 10-Yard Fight is the only one not even developed by them, but it was still published by them, it looks like.
All right.
What was the other Nintendo game you said that came out?
Those Ghosts and Goblins, I think, apparently.
Oh, okay. Was that... Let's see. I'm sorry. I know we're using...
At least according to just like a quick Google search of video games in 1985, Ghosts and Goblins.
Yeah, there you go. We're using
so.
Wikipedia for a lot. Yeah, so it looks like the arcade version came out in 1985. I wonder how different the arcade version is from the NES version. I imagine it couldn't be that different. I played it, but I just can't remember at the top of my head. Yeah, there's been a lot of versions of it, clearly. So, yeah, so that's an arcade release. I can't remember a lot else that came out in 1985. Gradius is a classic. I really like that one. Looks like that probably came out in the arcade. I think that's one of my favorite 2D shooters for sure. Oregon Trail, did that come out in 1985?
That might have. I want to say that might have been a little bit later, but. Yeah.
It's saying 1985 video game.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Oregon Trail. Don't give me the real Oregon Trail. The video game. Was it a board game before it was a video game? Huh. 1981 in games. Oregon Trail. Oh, come on.
It might be
the real one.
It might be a 1985 game.
It was a 1971 video game. It was a text-based strategy game? Was it the same thing? Yeah. Wow, it really did come out in 1971, it looks like.
Well, all right.
I wonder how widely available that was. Huh. All right, well, 1985, I would say not one of those years that... It's an iconic year because of Nintendo's foray into the scene outside of just Japan. Like, people might have known Nintendo worldwide because of Mario Bros. And because of Donkey Kong in 1981. They were known in the arcade space, but this is when they were really starting to get their grips on the gaming industry and really children and adults across America and families.
Also, just a quick heads up. Apparently, there was an Oregon Trail that released in 1985. It was for the Apple II. So
nice. We're running into that, like, oh, all these games came out across different hardware, so it's like tough to delineate. So, all right, 85. Going to 1986.
86. I'm starting to see a few bangers in this one. So.
Oh, bangers! So, before we go into that, the banger of all bangers, in my opinion, probably the greatest video game franchise ever created. The first game came out this year, and that's The Legend of Zelda. I think, without even looking at another game, that is the most iconic and greatest game that came out this year. What do you think about that?
I mean, yeah, I would say that's fair. Well, I mean, obviously it spawned arguably one of the best video game franchises of all time. So, but there was a few video games here that kind of started a franchise. So, obviously Legend of Zelda, but I guess while you're looking at that,
yeah, it's more like you can't talk about 1986 without talking about The Legend of Zelda.
Absolutely.
I think Outrun is a classic Sega game that was classic for them for a while. That's kind of like Pole Position, where it's one of those behind the back kind of arcadey games where you're just dodging cars going super fast. Adventure Island, I think that game's fun. You just it was challenging for me as a kid because you are always losing health, and it's kind of really challenging in that way. Have you ever played Adventure Island?
I have not. I do not know anything about this game.
Arkanoid's a freaking banger. I don't know if Arkanoid... pretty sure it came after Breakout, but that game's just always fun. Bubble Bobble. Game has great music, and it's really just a fun, addicting NES game that was co-op. Is there anything else you noticed from 1986?
Oh, I'm surprised you didn't notice Metroid up there in the top right.
I was going to let you talk about it a little bit. Have you played Metroid?
I haven't played the original Metroid, but I mean, I feel like this is definitely a game series that you are quite a bit more familiar with than me.
Absolutely. So I'm actually not a very big fan of the first Metroid game. I think as far as laying the groundwork goes, I'm actually of the same mindset of this with The Legend of Zelda. As far as laying the groundwork and being that first entry, like obviously it couldn't exist without it. I don't actually enjoy playing it very much. And just to, play my hand again, Castlevania came out in 1986 as well, and I don't believe it came out in America until 87. Yeah, America in 87. But just speaking generally about these three series, I actually think Castlevania is the most fun of these three games to play as far as going back to games from nearly 40 years ago. Metroid it's a good game. It's just I would have enjoyed it more if I was of age when it came out. I imagine the exploration would have been more, just awe-inspiring, just engrossing. But going back to it, whenever I played it as an 11-year-old in 2007, 2008, and I went back to it and played on the Wii Virtual Console, I found it very challenging. And whenever you have games that have released after it that you've played before that do what the game does better, it's hard to go back to. But absolutely iconic as far as being released at the time. Have you played any of the original Legend of Zelda or Metroid?
Not the original Metroid. I have played a little bit of the Legend of Zelda, and I mean, yeah, I will admit, maybe similar to Metroid, I wouldn't say it's aged super well at this point. I did also play the original Castlevania as well, and I did manage to beat it with a lot of save states, But yeah, I would say out of all the games I have played around this time, I would say Castlevania is my personal favorite.
Yeah, it's the most playable of those, and I think that's because the format of Castlevania. This one is a lot more straightforward to the point. It's linear. Your objective is always the same, and you know where you're going. And I think what becomes a problem with Metroid and the original Legend of Zelda is it's more frustrating because those answers aren't always given to you. And that kind of wild, wild west for those adventure games and these adventure games of the time, I'm sure there was a ton of mysticism and enjoyment to trying to figure out what we actually do. But going back to it, it can be harder to enjoy because, you don't want to spend 5 hours trying to figure out what bush you need to burn or what random block you need to shoot. That's something that's a lot more forgivable when you're 8 years old. And let's say you're born in 1982 and it's 1990 and you have a ton of time because you don't have anywhere to go on a weekend. But when you're going back to those games in the modern age, it's just a lot harder because you're used to those modern conventions of games like a map or just the game telling you what the objective is. And that's why I think personally Castlevania aged the best of those three. But oh my god, just looking at it so far, as far as the NES days of the 80s, this might have be an early favorite because I'm looking too and I see Dragon Quest, which is, from what I understand, like before Final Fantasy, this was the home RPG, turn-based RPG. I think they gave it away with copies of Nintendo Power, and it was just an absolutely iconic RPG game. I mean, just seeing this, and how primitive it was, but how so many games we still play to this day. How many of those options are there: run, fight, spell, item. That's still stuff that we do in Pokemon. You run, you use your items, and you fight. I mean, so I think that game deserves a lot of credit still to this day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also just throw out that Kid Icarus apparently came out around this time as well. So.
Oh yeah, Metroid and Kid Icarus are like sister games, from what I understand. They were developed around the same time with the same ideologies. So, ideologies around them. I'm not seeing a lot. Solomon's Key is a fun puzzle game. I like RBI Baseball. Mm-hmm. Did the Lost Levels come out in Japan in 1986?
I guess so.
They must have made the sequel pretty fast. They did, yeah. I don't like this game. I think it's bad. But I think it's absolutely of note being the sequel to Super Mario Bros.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't really played this one, so I think, yeah.
Yeah. It's not well designed. It's just hard for the sake of being hard, but not actually well made. Oh, I do see Kid Icarus here. I'm not really a big fan of Kid Icarus, but yeah, and Ikari Warriors, I understand it was a popular game at the time. So, and then Alex Kidd was actually, propped up to be kind of the original mascot for Sega before Sonic. So I think that has an iconic B or C level status in video game conversations to bring up. So I think, I'm not going to say it's a guaranteed like one of the best years in gaming, but as far as the 80s go, I'm going to give this, one of that middle for now, because I absolutely think 1986 it's doing a lot for itself. Legend of Zelda, Bubble Bobble, Dragon Quest, Metroid, Kid Icarus, Alex Kidd, Arkanoid, Outrun. There's actually a lot here, and for 1985 being one of those years in gaming where kind of the bubble started growing, and I think this is gonna probably start a string of years on the NES where things just really kind of pop off. Would you agree there?
Oh yeah, I think so. Just based on a quick little look through some of these later years, yeah, you can definitely start to see some more, at least for me, at least more familiar games. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for a lot of them, the first game in the series, it very rarely is the first game in a video game series the best game. So this isn't unique to that. A lot of the games, they lay the groundwork, and then this isn't always the case for movies, books, all that kind of stuff. For video games, it's actually very common that the sequel is really where things hit its really good stride. History will agree with me there, and I can think about that top of my head. But not on the NES, actually. NES is iconic for its sequels going in different directions. Before, it was kind of a rule that you needed to stay within your certain lane. And we'll find that a lot. For Metroid, not really, but Zelda and Castlevania and the American version of Mario 2, absolutely. But we'll go into that. So, yeah, I'm going to say it's one of those orange years. If we're saying that green is the top and red is not worth mentioning, I'm not saying that the orange is mid. I'm saying that this is still, that's a good year. I mean, that's a significant year in gaming. But 1987, top of my head, I think that's the year the first Mega Man game came out. But I see Punch Out and Contra here too. So based on what I'm seeing, I think 1987 might almost be like a continuation of that idea of 1986, where a lot of these iconic series that we still talk about to this day began. And you were the ones who filled out Punch Out and Contra. Was there anything else you ran into for 1987?
Well, funnily enough, 1987 had, from the looks of it, 2 sequels that you're talking about, Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2, it looks like, so...
Well, it's time to go into it then, huh?
Yeah.
So, Contra and Punch Out, do you have a lot of experience with those?
A little bit. I played them a bit, but yeah, I don't have the most experience with them personally. But I mean, from the little I did play of them, I thought they were fun. So I think I would also say from the little I've played of it, I think they've aged pretty well.
I think Contra aged incredibly. It's right up there with Castlevania as far as still being very playable to this day. And Punch Out is the best game in the series. Other than it's hard to really talk about the series of Punch Out, because after Super Punch Out, and Punch Out is a port of the arcade game, but when we talk about Punch Out, everyone's talking about the NES version. I guess it came out, or is Punch? Yeah, Mike Tyson's Punch Out is the one everyone's talking about. It came out in arcades, but maybe that's this 1990 Punch Out one. Do you know anything about that?
Punch Out. What?
Yeah, it's an adaptation of the Punch Out from 1984. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think. Okay. Yeah,
we've played this one at arcades before. I have, at least.
Okay, so yeah, it looks like Mike Tyson's Punch Out. I think that's the one that we all seem to know and love. And
yeah, that's the iconic one, and it deserves its icon status. That game is as every bit as playable now as it was then. It's still so enjoyable. It asks for every bit of your being and your focus to be successful in that game. And that's why it's still fun to this day. And it's such a challenge to understand the patterns to, the enemies and the characterization of who you're fighting. If that game could have been successful with 10% the amount of character, because the gameplay is so fun. But then the game has its own personality to it with each character that you fight, and Doc Lewis and Little Mac. That it really is just a fantastic game. And then it has one of the most iconic final bosses of all time in the real life heavyweight champion and Mike Tyson. So I really think Punch Out it's a heavyweight champion, baby. Sorry.
No, I get you there. Well, yeah, just quickly looking through some more games here. I just noticed that Metal Gear and Final Fantasy came out these years. So
yeah, so Final Fantasy originally released on the NES. So yeah, 1987 on the NES. Oh, came out in the NES in 1990 in America.
Oh,
is that right? Wow.
Okay, well, So
well, it's still these rules are going to be so inconsistent. So let's just say it came out in 1987 because that's when it developed. It's fine.
all right, yeah.
This game very much kind of is in the same vein of that Dragon Quest game, Dragon Warrior game from the year before, and it's those early iconic set the groundwork RPG series that is literally still to this day one of the most iconic series in gaming. And it's like I'm saying, 1986. Like these are the years where so many of the greatest series of all time are laying their groundwork, and a lot of these series have evolved to keep themselves relevant with modern game design, and people fell in love with them then, and they're still making new fans to this day, and it's so special. I really adore that. And I'm even a Final Fantasy fan. I've never played this game. I don't know. I've never played this game, but just I have so much respect for it for what it's done. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The fact that it came out in 1987, and now we have like Final Fantasy 16 coming out. I think maybe later this year, possibly. Is that right, or is it next?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I mean,
it should be later this year. I might get delayed or something, but who knows?
But
and we'll go into the sequels later. But the other, we have two other, in my opinion, very of note, iconic series that came out this year in Double Dragon. That, while it's not one of my favorite beat 'em up games of all time, or at least released in arcades in 1987. Yeah, the NES port is a little bit downgraded from that. From this look, it actually looks quite different. Maybe we'll see graphic. Yeah, it looks quite different. I don't know how similar the arcade version is to the NES version. So, I mean, it is the start of that series. So, you know, we'll keep it in 1987, I suppose. But that's an iconic beat 'em up series. While it hasn't done as well to stay relevant to this day, it's still something you hear about all the time. I mean, the sequel to this game was on the NES Classic Edition in 2016, and you and I even played that a little bit co-op. Maybe it hasn't aged the best, but from people I know who played games at the time, this is one of those, you know, iconic, memorable video games. And as far as laying the groundwork for beat 'em up games like Final Fight, River City Ransom, River City Girls, and
maybe Streets of Rage, possibly.
Streets of Rage. There you go. I mean, this is kind of the father of those. So definitely of note. But I will let you introduce what, in my opinion, is the game of the year, probably, as far as laying a groundwork for a video game franchise.
Okay, well, I will say, yeah, Mega Man, like, I think both, obviously, if you've watched our Mega Man X video, you know Carson and I do have some history with Mega Man, so, yeah, Mega Man was the start of the entire Mega Man series and stuff. It's definitely, well, I guess looking at it now, definitely not the strongest game on its own compared to some of its later games like Mega Man 2 and Mega Man 3, but, you know, obviously just the fact that this is what started it all, really. We started all with Mega Man, we leaned to Mega Man X, ZX, like all those other Mega Man games. Yeah, it's just another great series that started in this year, so.
Yeah, I am even more of the mind that this game didn't age very well, but different from Zelda and Metroid, where, you know, Zelda 2, it's hard to compare to the original Zelda because it's such a different game. And then Metroid, there wasn't another Metroid game on NES. For Mega Man, there are 5 more games on NES that are Mega Man games, Mega Man 1 through 6. And as far as those go, the visuals are very similar, the art style is similar, the structure of the game is similar. So really, and I know we said this a lot, it laid the groundwork. That's what it did. And while it hasn't aged very well at all, in my opinion, there are very, very outdated game design flaws and mechanics in this game that are not inexcusable, but they're very hard to go back to. And, you know, punishingly difficult in a wrong way. And just look at this box art. Somehow this game got a sequel, and that's really where, you know, Mega Man became, in my opinion, its iconic franchise. But it couldn't have done it without the first game, so it's hard to deny it that 1987 Mega Man, I mean, that is the birth of while it hasn't been in the last 5 to 10 years one of the iconic franchises in video game history, I mean, for the first 20 years of it, like until like maybe 2010, I mean, it had to be one of the hardest hitting video game series as far as expanding itself into different series and really trying to just keep itself relevant and just pumping out so many games. And, not all of them are good, but it's one of those things that you can really just fall in love with. And I know you and I both did.
Oh yeah, and of course, a slight little tangent here, but a lot of people were definitely excited to see Mega Man and Smash Brothers in like 2014. So,
absolutely. I mean, anybody who played video games in the 80s and grew up with the NES, I have no doubt in my mind that they played a Mega Man game and they liked it. I mean, that's just how I'm very confident in saying that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wouldn't doubt it either. So,
yeah, and this year stacking up to be just as good. I mean, I don't know if the series that got their groundwork laid here are as iconic as 1986 in the same way. I'm actually a fan of Final Fantasy, Mega Man, and Contra. I mean, Contra didn't stay the test of time, but we're still going into this. Did Street Fighter really start in 1987? The first arcade game?
Yeah, I think it was arcade. Yeah.
Wow. And this is the same story where in no way, shape, or form at all is Street Fighter a very good game that people are calling iconic and remembering forever. Like
the sequel.
Yeah, it was such a thing at the time. Video games just have that way where the first game got people intrigued in the concept, and then the second game was like, all right, we know what we're doing here. Let's delete what didn't work and then expand upon what did. When you think Street Fighter, you don't think this is Ryu with red hair. No, you think Guile, you think Ryu, you think Chun-Li, you think Ken, and you think of just really great fighting mechanics and iconic characters and music and all that stuff. You don't think about that game, but technically did start the series, so you have to mention it in the conversation. And damn it, you cannot forget Tecmo Bowl.
I think this was another arcade version that came out in 1980.
Darn it! So tough. Well, we'll talk about it 89 then. But God, I love Tecmo Bowl. But Mickey Mouse Brigade. This is a pretty good licensed 2D platformer. Go watch the Game Grumps episode. I'm just joking. Came out in 88 in NES. So, I think the last thing we have to talk about are this game and this game. So, out of the two game series that started the year before, we spoke about Zelda and Castlevania. Do you have any experience with these iconic sequels that went against the grain of what the series had created, even though this came out in Japan in 87? Holy crap, it took almost 2 years for this to come out in North America after it came out in Japan?
I guess.
What's the holdup? I mean, there's a good bit of text in the game, but I don't think there was enough. Yeah, so both of these sequels didn't actually come out in 1987 in America.
Oh, we can just stick with the initial date, perhaps, just to keep things consistent. Especially since when we Google it, it always says like the first year it came out, like the earliest.
I'm sorry
date,
that
so.
We're not very consistent on this, but Zelda 2 and Castlevania 2 notwithstanding, I'd say this is another one of those good years. I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'd say about on par with 1986. I would say, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we're really good. Gobbledygook.
Gobbledygook.
All right, so 1988. I really think it might be more of the same as things are getting established in the NES era, but I don't know if we're really getting established. I mean, the first 3 years of the NES era, while it really went deep in late into 1985 is when it began. 1986 and 87 is where the groundwork got established, where people were really becoming gamers for life just based on the iconography of the time. I think 1988 is where those things are established. Nintendo's a household name and people are playing video games and having those experiences as a much more common kind of thing. Is Mega Man 2 on your research the only game of note?
There are others. Well, again, like this kind of running into the same problem again. Like the Super Mario Brothers 3, for example, that got released in Japan in 1988, but not in the US until like 1990. So I wasn't sure if we want to include that.
It's so hard to have these conversations sometimes. I mean, I guess it only took between late 1988 and then early 1990 for it to get localized. Oh my god. It actually came out in America on the Play Choice 10, which was like a... Do you know anything about the Play Choice 10, Toby?
I do not know anything about that.
So the Play Choice 10 was this retail... Not a retail. It was this version of the NES that could be played and purchased like an arcade machine at gas stations, at arcades, at wherever, pizza places that people could purchase, and 10 NES games would be on it. There you see here, Kung Fu, Double Dragon, Contra, Excite Bike. I guess those cartridges are in there, and then you could play them with the arcade cabinet. So if you ever seen The Wizard, this is how I got introduced to the Play Choice 10. Because Jimmy in The Wizard is playing Double Dragon on a Play Choice 10. You probably can't see here very well, but that right here is a Play Choice 10 that he's playing on.
Okay.
Right there. So basically it was a version of the NES to be played at the store. And whenever... Or basically out in public. It was an arcade version of NES that already had preloaded NES games on it. And whenever in the movie The Wizard, if you remember that movie, that's where Super Mario Bros. 3 actually got revealed. Jimmy's character, that's how Fred Savage's character found out that Jimmy was good at video games, is because he played Double Dragon on a Play Choice 10. That's how I learned what a Play Choice 10 was. But yeah, looks like an advert from back in the day. 10 top games in one Goliath cabinet, available in a Goliath-style cabinet and a new cabinet designed for the concept of games for pub operations. So, yeah, I imagine Nintendo would sell this and then sell off 10 games that were probably of their own, but also licensed. Looks like a lot of these are Nintendo games or the most popular games from the NES that they probably licensed out. So, yeah, it looks like Mario Bros. 3 came out in the middle of 89, like 7-ish months before its NES release on the Play Choice 10. So could the official release in America, people could just go out to their local pizza place and play Mario Bros. I need to read into that, but that's such an interesting thing to even think about, huh?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to figure out which year we want to put this in now, but
I guess we'll go by America. So let's say Super Mario Bros. 2 came out in 1988 in America. So yeah, we'll list that as an American game. So 1988 Super Mario Bros. 2. Super Mario Bros. 2. It's been the game of the year for every year. But do you have any experience playing Super Mario Bros. 2?
Very minimal. I mean, I don't know. It's necessarily a bad game on its own. It's just like not really a Mario game, I guess, in a way. Well, at least not like the traditional Mario game, like Mario Brothers, Mario Brothers 3, or Mario World, you know. But
yeah, I actually think it's a very good game. It has a lot of character to it, but it's that age-old conversation where it is impossible to talk about this game without talking about the following game I'm going to look up. Literally, I look up on Wikipedia Doki Doki Panic. You look it up, and it's just a footnote on a different page. So, have you played through this game?
I haven't. No, I think I just played a little bit of like the first couple of levels, but
yeah, it is quite literally the same game, Doki Doki Panic, as Super Mario Bros. 2. You know, I'm pretty sure this. It's hard to. Okay, yeah, this is Mario. That's Luigi. That's the princess. That's Toad. Toad is good at picking up items. Princess Peach can float. Luigi is slippery and can jump higher, and Mario is just your standard all-around man. I think it's a good game. I don't go back to it as often, but it's hard not to mention it in the NES like backlog as being iconic in its own way. Because when people played it back in the day, they didn't know. They just thought this is the sequel to Super Mario Bros. 2. Meanwhile, Nintendo had this game in the back of their pocket that they created, and publisher, Nintendo, that they created. They're like, well, the other game that we talked about a few years ago, too hard. We'll just release this game and change the sprites. And it's interesting to think about that. Characters like the Shy Guy and, the Wart never came back, but
Birdo,
some of these characters, Birdo, like these characters that are, they're a part of the history of Mario as being, right up there with Koopas and Goombas, as they're there, and they weren't created for Mario, and I think that's probably the most interesting thing that comes from that.
Mm-hmm. I would assume like Princess Peach's down special in Smash Brothers, where she takes out a turnip, probably came from this game as well, right?
Absolutely. That's easily the most iconic thing about the video game.
Yeah.
Nah, I'm joking. But, just if Google, obviously we've been using Google for all this here, if Google's anything to go off of, Super Mario Bros. 2, we'll count that for sure. Final Fantasy 2, did it really release the sequel in just a year? It looks like it. I haven't played the sequel. I imagine it is, second verse, kind of same as the first game. I couldn't imagine those games took very long to make. If you actually look back from game development back then, I think a lot of these dev processes might have been like 10 months long. Mm-hmm. So, but yeah, if you told me, I had a gun to my head and said which Final Fantasy is this, I couldn't answer that question. So, I imagine
I do
a lot of.
Sorry, to interrupt. I did want to mention. I know Final Fantasy 2 obviously came out in Japan in 1988, but I know there was like a funny situation where like America didn't get all the Final Fantasy games, right? Like,
oh yeah, so we're still going off that confusion from Japan to America.
Yeah, because I think we got like Final Fantasy 1 and our Final Fantasy 2 was actually like Final Fantasy 3 or something like that. Was that right? And then like our Final Fantasy 3 was actually their Final Fantasy like 6.
How could I forget that, Toby? How could I forget that? Yes. So the original Final Fantasy 2 that America got was Final Fantasy 4,
okay.
And that released in America in 1991 on the Super Nintendo, but it was called Final Fantasy 2 in America. You're absolutely right. And then Final Fantasy 6 was called Final Fantasy 3 in America. That just totally went over my head. So, yeah, I guess it's iconic in 1988 only if you lived in Japan.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if it came out in America by then, the original Final Fantasy. So, I guess we won't count it. And I don't even think Dragon Warrior 3 came out. Yeah, didn't come out on the NES until after the Super Nintendo was out. So we can't trust Google on everything. So because the only thing we have to do kind of that research, because the only thing we have listed here was Mega Man 2, and of course you have to give Mega Man 2 that respect. Did come out in 1988, and absolutely the best game that came out that year. Do you have any disagreement on that?
I do not. Although. I'm taking a quick look, and from the looks of it, Mega Man 2 might have actually been released in the US in 1989.
Oh my goodness. I'm not really following my own rules here. Maybe this is more of just a history discussion than it is talking about what was. I think these things become more clear as there was less of a separation from Japan to America as we get deeper into the timeline. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
When we talk about in 2001, because game development was very Eastern based at this time. Like, we're not talking about these great United States games that were developed. These are all games that are getting localized from Japan, and I imagine there's a process to that, as there's a North American branch to all of these publishing companies, and it's taking quite a bit of time for them to bring it out to the States and Canada and whatever else. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess for now we'll just kind of have to trudge along with all these funny release dates, but later on it'll be a little better.
It's a lot harder, but in 2001 we're not going to be talking about Halo and say, did that come out in Japan and actually in 1998? No. There's a lot more of a synergy between the release dates in video games as time went on, because people had more of their finger on the pulse of what games were coming out, and they didn't want there to be these years and years gaps between localization. They're like, give me the games, you know what I mean? So that kind of toughens up these discussions of the time, but I think almost, defines the time, because it was kind of the dog early days of video games. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely a little more primitive, like pre-internet and such. And I imagine like a lot of these game studios and stuff probably just weren't as big per se. And like, I'm not obviously, I know you mentioned how that's a nice little picture right there. Game dev was obviously kind of quick, as you mentioned, but I don't know if like the translation teams and such were like as big of a focus per se. Yeah, it was just a lot more.
I think these companies knew that they were going to profit more out of bringing things to the States, but I wonder why. Maybe that process behind bringing it over was just harder, and they probably, the NES in Japan was called the Famicom, but from what I understand, after a while, a lot of these games were coming out on the Famicom disk system. So maybe they were being developed for disk, and we're having to, maybe there's a development process to bring them to a cartridge. Do you know about the Famicom disk system?
Not a whole lot, no.
Yeah, in Japan in 1986, the Famicom disk system. Yeah, or because before that, I believe it was just the Famicom, because it was 1986. So, yeah, a lot of these games were maybe just in a whole different format. Maybe there was some issue with that. I don't know.
I guess also to like reiterate, like since the internet and stuff wasn't as big of a, well, it just like wasn't really a thing back then.
It was only a thing if you had like a giga computer and worked at like a specific place. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So like I'm pretty sure like Japan just would just release games to America whenever they wanted. And, like for us, like we just wouldn't be none the wiser, because I'm pretty sure back then we didn't realize Super Mario Brothers 2 was just another game, Doki Doki Panic, and we didn't realize when we got Final Fantasy 2 it wasn't actually Final Fantasy 2. Like, so
absolutely, I think that's like, that is so important to bring up, because that everyone was none the wiser, like you said. So it's not even an issue. It's an issue when you go back in retrospective and try to be like, oh, Final Fantasy 2 from Japan, do we call it a 1988 game, or do we call it, when did Final Fantasy 2 actually release in America? I don't think it released in America until the PlayStation 1 days. Let's see. It didn't come out in America until 2003. So, yeah, it's hard to have those conversations, but they kind of describe what those times were like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're just kind of under Japan's mercy in a way.
Yeah. But yeah, Mega Man 2, we only mentioned it for a second, but it did release in 1989, so I guess we're not talking about it? I know you listed it here, so I wasn't sure what we were going to talk about it there. But.
Yeah, I don't think I was even consistent with my own rules and listing it down in the...
It's really tough. So. Like, whenever we go off of Google, which, yeah, I'm just using Google for a lot of this, because it's tough. Of course we have to use Google to try to research, and I shouldn't just be using, from sources across the web. But just looking here, Blaster Master might be a great one to call out. Have you ever played Blaster Master?
I don't think so, no.
It did come out in 1988.
All right, nice.
I have played Blaster Master, and I actually think it is like well ahead of its time. Really interesting game. It's kind of Metroid-esque. I'd say the way it works is kind of like, it has like Metroid-esque overworld where you play in this tank called Sophia the Third.
Okay.
And play in this like Metroidvania-esque world where you're not exactly told where to go. You get to explore, upgrade your ship, and try to find where to go. And then there's these sections of the game that are more top-down. I wouldn't say Zelda, but they're kind of are dungeons, but with these shooting mechanics, top-down shooting mechanics. So it's actually a really diverse gameplay-wise game, and I'd say it's actually, for the time, very ambitious. Like, of course, you're seeing very high scores here for the time, because it was kind of, very, very far ahead of its time. Now, I find it hard to go back to because it's almost intimidating, but it did have a lot to do with inspiring a lot of the games of the future. And I've actually, whenever the Switch came out, this Blaster Master Zero game came out, and I did get very much into that game as it came out around when the Switch came out. But I quite enjoyed this game, and can attribute it to 1988 for sure as one of the more impressive games of the year. But other than that, Ninja Gaiden. We'll see. We'll say, when did it come out in America?
In 1989. I took a look at it really quick. So.
oh freaking boy! So we don't want to include that. Ice hockey. That's a good NES sports game. Made by Nintendo. Did in fact come out in 1988. It's just a good sports game, but it is fun to this day. Did Splatterhouse come out in 1988? 1989. So 1988 is actually feeling like it might not be at the same level as the last 2 years. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I guess if we're gonna go by American release dates, then yeah, a lot of those, like the biggest hitters, Super Mario Brothers 3, Ninja Gaiden, and yeah, they're all 1989 actually. So yeah.
I think it's important to try to be consistent with that. Not that we have been, but because, for the time era that this is, people weren't even aware of these games because Japan is just one country out of the entire world. You know what I mean? So
right. It's
hard to consistently use Japan as the benchmark for when games released because that's when probably only, I'm not all cases, but only a minority amount of the amount of people who ended up even experiencing the game actually got to play it. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess we have to set the benchmark somewhere, and I guess since we're both Americans, so I guess it would make sense in this regard just to kind of set America as the benchmark. But yeah.
Yeah. So let's say 1986, 1987, as far as the 80s NES years so far, have been stronger.
Yep, I agree.
So, 1989. Before we go into the games that came out this year, I mentioned that the NES came out in 1985, and we also have the release of the Game Boy in 1989. Have you ever played the Game Boy?
Not the original Game Boy, no. I might have tried it at your place way back when, but like once, but I've never really played it much myself, so.
Yeah, I feel like it is really cemented itself, like just the design of the console, and those two red buttons, and honestly, how not at all sleek it looks, it is iconic, and I've used that word a lot, but Nintendo has most of what they've ever done has been iconic. They've every 4 or 5 years they do something that has a mark on someone's childhood or the culture of the time, and absolutely the NES, and then now here the Game Boy. That's the culture of the time. Once the Game Boy came out, it changed gaming forever. People still to this day are playing games handheld, and while just like a lot of the games of the time in the NES, the first attempt wasn't where they hit out on all cylinders, and actually the original 1989 Game Boy lasted until 1998 with the Game Boy Color. It's hard to go back to, but it is impossible to decline its legacy.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, you mentioned it was clunky before. Definitely just a kind of the technology back then, really. Obviously, the fact that everything had this like weird greenish tint to it. And I think they're also selling these little like add-ons where you could put on a little lamp over the screen in order to see it better. I mean, obviously, looking at it now, it's probably not something I would play on a bunch, but obviously we can't deny the fact that it's like the forefather of all handheld consoles or handheld devices for gaming. So in that respect, obviously it deserves respect. So,
and honestly, I'm even going to put Tetris right here because I truly, and I know we've had no consistency to this point, Tetris made its mark in 1989.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, this is when it got developed, and it's the same thing as that sort of, it took 5 years for Tetris to become that phenomenon. And I think this is honestly a discussion that kind of gets involved up into this day and age that we run into here. Obviously, the current year is 2023, but we are still talking about and playing games that are having these impacts, even though technically they released years and years and years before, because there is an idea that these games can exist and be iterated upon and improved, and people will still play it over time. You know what I mean by that? Like, people are still playing Fortnite, people are still playing Animal Crossing because the games are being updated. And I don't know, maybe games as a service is the wrong way to look at it, but these games are still being... maybe it's an early way to look at it. I don't know, but Tetris came out in 1984, and the way it's continued to exist since then, it's hard to attribute to a year, because Tetris, throughout this entire sheet, never stops becoming iconic or relevant. Literally every 3 or 4 years, there's a new version of Tetris that everyone's like, whoa, you gotta play this version of Tetris. But I'm gonna put Tetris there because that's when the Game Boy version became what it is. I'm gonna top selling Game Boy games. Let's see. Right under Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow in America, 35 million units sold. Released in 1989. Tetris right there. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's impossible to decline that legacy. And then, talking about the Game Boy right there, we also have Super Mario Land. Have you ever played Super Mario Land?
I have not. And honestly, I'm going to check really quickly to see if it was released.
It was. Guarantee it.
It was, yeah.
So no worries.
It matters at all. It was released in Europe and Australia in 1990, but I guess...
fuck them. I think it being the first handheld 2D version of a Mario game, it's iconic in that way, but I actually don't think this game is very good, and it is like distinctly not very Mario. There's like UFOs in the game. There's like these 2D shoot 'em up levels, and I think that kind of attributes to it was the early days of, these characters. I mean, Mario Bros. 2 wasn't even a Mario game. Mario Land, we have these UFOs and these pyramids and these 2D shoot 'em up levels where I think Nintendo was still really experimenting with who Mario was and what games he was going to be in. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely. And I don't think he even saves Princess Peach in this one. It's Daisy, isn't it?
Yep. This is the introduction of Daisy, and he's not even in the Mushroom Kingdom. He's in Sahasra Land.
Yeah, some like funny name, like Sahara Land.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
I mean, although I must say this design of Mario on the front cover, I think it really stands the test of time. I mean, this is really what Mario still looks like to this day, and this is before technically Mario Bros. 3 came out in America. So Mario Bros. 2, if this was the box art that came out in 1988. Oops, wrong Mario Bros. 2. So this was the box art that we talked about that came out in 1988. This is still an early design of Mario, I would go. I think this is still a much more iconic, recognizable version of Mario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so too. Just I think the 88 version of Mario, I think his skin color looks a little darker than like what he normally is now, I would say. So
yeah, I'd say his outfit is... he's got the red overalls.
Oh, yeah.
The blue shirt.
It's like color inverted.
We know Mario as red shirt, blue overalls, but very much still in the 80s, he kind of was the red overalls, blue shirt guy. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, and it's funny because this does a better job of portraying Mario and the idea we know him than the actual game does. But I'm not gonna discount Super Mario Land after that though, because it is a handheld Mario game, and it did so much for Mario, so he has to be involved there. And while I don't enjoy going back to it as much because it is such a weird game, it is absolutely one of the most important games that came out that year.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't talk about 1989 and the NES without talking about DuckTales. What a game. Have you played that one?
I have played that one, although my original first time playing it was on like some like weird Game Boy Color cartridge thing. So it wasn't technically on the NES, but I mean, I think the weird cartridge version I played, it's still essentially the same game. So, yeah, I would definitely say it's a classic. Obviously, great music. I think the Moon, people consider it one of the greatest themes like of all time.
Ducks in outer space from the Disney afternoon to the mound.
Okay.
I'm so sorry. That was the Brental Floss Moon DuckTales theme with lyrics.
Okay. Well, I mean, hey, there you go. I mean, it's iconic enough that people were making like lyric videos for it. So
yeah, so this is very much a game that I myself, as someone who was really discovering retro video games in his preteen years, with YouTube, like with people with AVGN and Screw Attack and Brental Floss. This is one of those games that I learned about being what it is, and I have played it since then, and even played the remaster version. And you know that when a game that came out in 1989 gets a completely done-up remastered version 24 years later, it has to be special, right? The music's incredible. It's just a solid platformer. I don't think it's one of the best games ever made, but as far as the time it came out, it is such a succinct, quality, just good time. I think it's a really good game. And Capcom, they never missed back then, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think they still do great to this day, but I really think in the 80s and early 90s, they really knew how to make 2D platformers, and they made a lot for a lot for Disney at the time, licensed out, and they knew what they were doing. So we can't deny DuckTales. But going in, I do see Mother. So Mother, if we're going with that America versus US thing, Mother did not release in America.
Yeah,
but it did release what, on the Famicom?
Yeah, Japanese only release, and I think it was the Famicom, but yeah.
So I believe this came out on the Wii U as Earthbound Beginnings, right?
Perhaps. Yeah, I'm not quite sure about Mother and like Earthbound and such. They aren't games I've really played a whole lot of, but like obviously I know that's where Ness and Lucas from Mother 3, they came from that. And
yeah, in 2015 they released this in the Wii U Virtual Console as Earthbound Beginnings, because it's Earthbound 1, but Earthbound is Mother 2. So yeah, this never got an official American release technically under the Mother title, but and I've never played it, but it looks very much in that Dragon Warrior, Dragon Quest vein, the first-person turn-based RPG elements. But from what I understand, Mother series is more of like a modern style RPG in the fact that you play as like kids, and yeah, like they use baseball bats and toy guns, and they are in a city, in a town, and it's very much more modern day in that way. And I think for that, and especially for inspiring the future that was to come, it's iconic in that way. And yeah, it's modeled off the gameplay of the Dragon Quest series, but it's set in the late 20th century United States. It's almost like I read the Wikipedia page, but it said different words. Promise I didn't mean to. I was just saying what I know off of it. Made by Shikasato Itoi, and I think he is, yeah, in fact, iconic for making Earthbound. So yeah, Mother, and he canceled his Cabbage game. Poor guy. He made Monopoly. What?
All right. I see you, Ito.
Anyways, yeah, you can't deny Mother, and I'm trying to think what else came out in 19 off the top of my head. Can we say Ninja Gaiden? Came out.
I guess so. You may not see it in the Google thing because it came out in Japan in 1988, I think, but I believe we saw it came out in 1989 in America. So I was
Ninja Gaiden. Oh. Yeah, let's just say, as far as the NES is concerned, well, the arcade version came out in '88. This stuff's so hard to track.
I think there's I saw multiple different types of Ninja Gaidens when I was looking at it, like when games released in 1988. I think I actually saw Ninja Gaiden released twice or something like that.
Interesting.
Well, it was listed twice, not released twice per se, but.
Well, this is also another iconic game series that released at the time. Can't deny it. So, we'll involve it in this time frame in general. Anything else that came out in 1989? Batman the game. I know the movie came out in 1989, but so it's hard not to involve it in those discussions. Yeah, it came out in 1990 on the NES, but the movie came out in 89. That's actually an iconic licensed game. While we probably won't release it in the Game of the Year by year, as far as licensed games goes at the time, DuckTales and Batman are making a good showing for licensed games not being, something to scoff at. The games that are made off of license like Batman and DuckTales, you don't have to go to the store and think that they're going to be these games with less effort, less budget, less time or care put into it, that were just decided in, a marketing committee and a round table that said, hey, well, we'll release this movie and we'll make an album soundtrack and a game that'll release at the time. No, these were people really putting time into these games, and that's one of those games at the time. It's extremely hard, and it's very much in the vein of an NES 2D platformer. While we probably won't release it in here, I think it's worth mentioning. Final Fight, did that come out in 1989?
Not sure, but I was gonna say, we saw Tecmo Bowl before, which.
Oh, Tecmo Bowl!
Yeah, it was released in arcade in 1987, but on the NES 1989, that's the one that you and I have played. So,
well, we have to say that Tecmo Bowl is an incredible sports game, and I still think it's one of the greatest sports games ever made to this day.
Heck yeah.
Me personally.
Me
personally.
Yeah, I thought it was fun too. As someone who doesn't really play much like sports games really in general, I definitely still thought I had a lot of fun with Tecmo Bowl. So
yeah, it's a shoulder tackle through a glass window sort of fun kind of game you can play. You know what I mean?
If you know, you know. Yep.
If you know, you know. Yeah, so we'll definitely introduce that in 1989 as a banger. Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse came out in North America in 1990, so we won't involve that yet. But if you're in that Google Doc, I suppose you can write it down. Strider, that's an iconic Capcom series. Didn't release in America. It came out in 89 in the arcades. I haven't played this game a lot, but I've always been super interested in it. Do you know Strider very well?
I do not know much about Strider, unfortunately.
It's just like a fast-paced ninja 2D platformer hack and slash game.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But it's always looked so fun. I've always actually really wanted to get into the reboot that came out in 2013, I believe. It's still, to an extent, a series to this day. But Capcom, I think Capcom, other than Nintendo, they were the biggest hitter on NES. Maybe Konami's up there too, but
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's some good games worth mentioning that came out this year. River City Ransom is a very good beat 'em up that I've played. It has some cool elements to it, but it came out in 1989.
A game that did come out in 1989 looks like is Prince of Persia.
So I actually don't care much for Prince of Persia, the original game. Have you ever played it? It's interesting because it's like that rotoscoped animation.
Mm-hmm. I can't remember if people thought this game was good or bad, but I feel like some people, like, there were some older Prince of Persia games that people kind of liked. Like, well, obviously...
I was more into the 3D Prince of Persia games, like the Sands of Time.
Mm-hmm. I assume...
That came out, like, in the early GameCube days and such. But...
Yeah, I assume this is what started that series at the very least, though, right? It's...
Yeah, and they even got a video game movie that, when I watched it back in the day, I didn't think it was the worst, but I never liked how this game controlled, personally. It's very stiff.
Yeah, and, I've never played it, but from what I've seen, it looks very, like, clunky and clumsy.
Yeah, it's like one of those games where you hit left or right and it doesn't actually react to what you're doing until another minute or two later. But it has its spot in gaming history. I think this game, I think it inspired a lot of those games like Out of This World and Strange World and a lot of those more animation based 2D platformers. You know what I mean?
Yeah, was this like the first? Well, I'm kind of just throwing stuff out there sort of at this point, but was this like the first game that kind of tried to do some like parkour like stuff? Like, I know you could like climb up ledges in this game, right?
I'm pretty sure you can in Strider, but I don't know. As far as like vertical platforming, you mean? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know as well on that spot.
All right, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of games in history, so I mean, we're not going to know
Hey,
them all.
SimCity came out in 1989. I've never played it, but I know a lot of people like SimCity, so we'll just put SimCity there.
All right, fair enough.
Did I just delete something? Yeah, Super Mario. Oh, I did. Oh, what was right here that I deleted? I don't know. SimCity.
Shoot, yeah, I'm not sure. What was that?
So I'm actually going to say this is one of those orange years. And the last that we'll go for in this video recording is the year of 1990. So this is actually kind of a transitionary year. We've had 4 straight full years of the NES and arcade, and even had the advent of the Game Boy in 1989. That, ushered in a new way for people to play video games. And now that, the NES has been around for 5 years, the idea of advancements to gaming wasn't really popular. Like, people didn't understand. People maybe thought back then that you would play your NES forever. People would just keep making games for the NES because they didn't understand iterations, like a Super Nintendo after that. Like, it was on the horizon, but 1990 actually is when the Super Famicom came out. And while we're only talking about North America, I think the rumblings of the 16-bit and advancements to home console gaming was really starting to make its mark. Because actually, we didn't talk about it, but in 1989, the Sega Genesis released, did it not?
Maybe. I don't have the exact date memorized.
But. Yeah, it came out in America in 1989, and we went the whole time without mentioning it. So, let's see. Sega Genesis games 1989. Let's just go by NA and see how. I imagine it released late in the year, and not many games really came out, and that looks to be mostly true. Space Harrier, Super Thunderblade. I play that game; it's not good at all.
Okay.
Ghouls and Ghosts came out for the Genesis. Golden Axe, that looks like the last one. That's probably the most iconic game that even came out that year for the Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
Did Altered Beast not even come out in the Genesis at that time? I knew that was a pack-in game. But did it not come out until 90? I know it was an arcade game, but when did it come out on the Genesis? Huh. There's just too many versions for it to even tell me.
Did it not get released in America at all? At least according to those release dates in there. Oh, worldwide.
WW is worldwide, yeah. So it came out in 88. We didn't even mention it. I think this game's not good at all, personally. But it did have its audience at the time because it was badass.
Okay.
But, yeah, I think as far as the Genesis coming onto the scene at the time, absolutely have to mention that. But, as I mentioned, that idea of the advent and advancement of video games was starting to become more on people's minds. We have the Game Boy. People can play video games in their car, not while they're driving. I'm talking with their kid. You can play at the doctor's office, but also you can play games that have these, much better graphics. This isn't what games on the NES looked. There was no game on the NES that looked this good. But also, if I'm not mistaken, the TurboGrafx 16 also came out in 1989 in America, and that's another 16-bit console. And while I imagine there weren't many games that also came out in 1989 for that. Looks like, wow, there's not a chronological release schedule for when the games came out. Maybe there is.
I think you have it chronologically now, but yeah.
Yeah. It looks like they're not actually. A lot of these games stayed in Japan. The TurboGrafx 16 wasn't nearly as popular as even the Genesis. But yeah, it looks like we're not seeing a lot of games. R-Type I've heard of. That's from what I understand, pretty iconic 2D shoot 'em up game. Victory Run, never heard of. Keith Courage and Alpha Zones. Sounds slightly familiar, but I don't know. Zero Wing. I've heard of Zero Wing. Have you?
I have not, no.
Maybe not. Never mind. I thought this was the All Your Base Are Belong to Us game.
Well, we can look that up really quickly. Just, I mean,
Yeah,
if nothing else.
All Your Base Are Belong to Us.
I did come from Zero
Yes.
Wing, apparently.
Yeah, so that game has its own icon status to it as well.
Yeah.
That's an old internet joke, isn't it? But yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of Fighting Street. That's the first Street Fighter game, but we already talked about that. Yeah, it's worth mentioning that TurboGrafx 16 came out, but I don't know how much the games are worth mentioning. It's only worth mentioning in the idea that maybe Nintendo was feeling the pressure of, hey, people aren't just going to buy the NES forever if we have these competitors who are releasing the Genesis and the TurboGrafx 16. You know, very much back in the day, people were like, what can graphics do for us? And the advancements of gaming. And, you know, Nintendo advanced gaming with the Game Boy, but people were probably thinking, hey, what can we do on the Nintendo side as far as, you know, matching up with this Genesis TurboGrafx 16. And while the Super Famicom did come out in 1990, we're not actually going to see the advent of that in America until 1991. So we actually have the last North American year of the NES here with 1990. And here we saw still some iconic games releasing out. Dr. Mario, we both played it. Are you a big fan?
Well, you know, I enjoyed Dr. Mario. Well, I don't know if I played like the original like NES version, particularly, but I played like
It doesn't really matter. I've played it on the. I think we've played it before on the NES Classic Edition together, but the gameplay is the same regardless where you do it at. So whenever you're playing the game in 2010, it's the same idea. You know what I mean?
Okay, yeah, I think
It's like Tetris.
played it on like the Wii Virtual Console or something like that.
Yeah, and it's iconic. It's awesome. It's a really cool game. Did it actually come out in 1990? My fact-checking friend.
I think it looks like it did. Yes.
Oh, thank God. So it looks like even now we're starting to actually see less discrepancy between even months of when these games are releasing. So that's good. Mega Man 3. I think we're getting to the point where it's harder to bring up even anything that interesting to say about the differences between a lot of Mega Man games. That's not Mega Man 3.
Oh, well, that's interesting. I mean, that's the same pose that Mega Man does in Mega Man 3, or like the Mega Man 3 box cover. So that's.
He does that pose, but that's not actually the
Okay.
cover art. That's like a snippet of the cover art.
Yeah, he's like firing at a Lek Man or something, or Spark Man, something like that.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's hard to even bring up a lot that's that different. I'd say the introduction of the slide is probably the most iconic part about the game,
I think.
and it really just does more to solidify the Mega Man series as an iconic, enjoyable 2D platformer.
I mean, I do think there's some debate or discussion on whether Mega Man 2 or 3 is like the best out of the NES original like 6 NES games. So, for what it's worth,
I think 2 is better only in the idea that 3 has those Doc Robot stages that I think are totally superfluous to the game.
Okay.
That's just my thought, but yeah, I mean, don't have to talk a lot about Mega Man 3. It's a great game. You listed Secret of Monkey Island. Have you played that?
I mean, I haven't actually played it, no, but I feel like that's a pretty popular point and click game that people liked back in the day. So.
Yeah, is this a LucasArts game?
I believe
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is whenever this Star Wars Lucas was done with Star Wars, and he was kind of branching into different ideas, and he made LucasArts, and obviously he wasn't making these games, but he was behind the studios that were making them. And I know that these are iconic games. Isn't this character called LeChuck?
Maybe.
Or there is some character called LeChuck? I don't know, but
Push up.
yeah, it's definitely worth mentioning that these games released. Neither of us have played them, but There you go. That came out in 1990. Video games of 1990.
It's definitely a game I'd like to maybe try out at some point, or at least some games in the series. So
yeah, in the United Kingdom, what we had, in the United States, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles released. Was that the arcade game? This game, damn. So nothing did not come out in 1990. Best-selling home system, best-selling home video games. There we go. Super Mario World. That came out in 1991 in America. God, this stuff gets very hard to follow. Wouldn't you agree?
yeah. Well, I guess
United States. Can I actually trust this? So the best-selling games in the United States were games that came out years before. Game of the Year in 1990, Final Fight.
that's for
So
Japan.
yeah,
I was gonna say that's for Japan and the UK apparently. So
it looks like there's not a lot to mention as far as 1990, as far as talking strictly on America.
when did F-Zero come out? Oh, that was also
That's 1991 for America because the Super Nintendo didn't come out till then.
okay.
I know Little Nemo was a little bit of a cult Capcom 2D platformer. I've never played it, so I don't have much to say about it, but it's actually based on a Japanese movie, so
Okay.
that's Capcom always hitting on their licensed stuff, but I don't have a lot to say about 1990. What about
I guess if we want to talk about games that only released in Japan, then like I think the first Fire Emblem game came out in 1990. Shadow Dragon, the Blade of Light.
yeah, that's absolutely worth talking about. I mean, it laid the groundwork for the whole series. I have nothing to say about it because I never played it. If you have anything you want to talk about, like,
I mean,
the floor is yours.
okay. Admittedly, I haven't played it either. I know it definitely doesn't look like it's aged super well. So there's definitely some.
I know they did like a limited release for it for the Switch. Is that correct?
Yeah, something like that. Admittedly, I didn't pick it up, but I mean, again, it's one of those games where like, yeah, it's the start of Fire Emblem, and I would say it's a pretty well-known franchise at this point, semi-niche, but like, I feel like people are at least familiar with it. But the first game though, it's I would say it's definitely shown its age. But
yeah, we didn't even talk about Paperboy coming out in 1985. Yeah, but I'm not seeing a lot of Game Boy games that came out in 1990 that were very iconic. And then NES was probably lining down the list of NES games. Seems like we really don't have much to say for 1990, huh?
Well, if I'm just looking at the quick Google search of video games from 1990, yeah, I don't have too much to say from the looks of it.
So starting in December, Nintendo World Cup, it's a soccer game, Ninja Crusaders. Yeah. Silver Surfer is an incredibly hard game. Mega Man 3, Dr. Mario, Super Glove Ball, I guess we can talk about. That's when the Power Glove came out. That speaks for itself.
And just some other random games that came out. Well, this is a Japan-only release, but those Metal Gear 2, Solid Snake.
Yeah, that was on the MX Spectrum, I believe, or something like that.
Yeah, like MSX2.
We didn't talk about Castlevania 3, did we?
Oh, no, we did not. Yeah, that was released in 1990 in North America.
Castlevania 3 is very much, in my opinion, the true sequel to Castlevania 1 as far as the gameplay structure. And it's a good game. I would rather go back to Castlevania 1 9 times out of 10 just because it's more streamlined. But Castlevania 3 is probably a better game. It's just so much harder. And to me, it has less of an icon status just because I've played the first one so much more. So maybe I have to go back more to Castlevania 3, but that's certainly worth mentioning for the year.
Oh, I guess you said true sequel, although I guess in a way it's technically a prequel, quote unquote. But
oh yeah, you got a good point to that. I guess the idea of development, it's a sequel, but the story,
yeah,
it's a sequel.
Mm-hmm.
Back to the Future 2 and 3. Punch Out. Did Punch Out come out in America in 1990 and we didn't realize, Toby?
Well,
okay. The re-release of Mr. Dream, huh? Yeah, they released it to take Mike Tyson out, huh?
Yeah, I guess.
Guess he bit some guy's ears off.
So yeah, so another random game that C came out in 1990. It was apparently Railroad Tycoon. If we want to mention that, I don't.
You can. I don't know anything about that.
I don't either. I don't know how these earlier sim games were, but obviously these sim games are pretty big nowadays. I would guess Railroad Tycoon's like one of those games that a lot of people know about and are familiar with, at least. So
it really feels like, just from a glance, that not that they were in a transition year, but 1990 felt mostly par for the course. It felt like we're before where things are really developing, progressing with, the 16-bit era really hitting its stride. But maybe 1990, growing pains isn't the right word, but
just like
a transition period. Would you feel that way?
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Transitional period between like the NES and SNES sort of thing.
Yeah, the great years of the 80s of the NES that everyone's remembering, they're over, and little do we know it, people have a lot of great stuff to look forward to, because God, there's so much good stuff to talk about after that. Just spoiler alert, Super Nintendo was probably my favorite game library of all time, even though I mentioned we'll have so much more to talk about after a certain point. God, we can make a video for every year. Maybe we'll get to that point. Toby and I don't think we realized how deep these discussions for every year would go. Yeah. We've been talking for an hour and 45 minutes, and we've only gone over
the 80s.
8 years. 8 years, huh? Right?
Yeah.
And we've probably been averaging like 10 to 15 minutes a year. But I think we realized that our discussions kind of became more, and I'm not going to say this definitively, but more expansive than just saying, 87, Punch-Out Contra, good year. 88, Mega Man 2, Mega Man Bros., bad year. Like, we were really like going into the history and the story and what led each thing to each year, and really kind of going through gaming history. And I think when I invited you to do this isn't really how we originally planned it, right?
Not what I originally was thinking, but I don't mind it. It's definitely more interesting than just kind of reading a list of games and seeing like, oh yeah, these games were good. All right, next year.
I think we're certainly going to get to that point. Like, maybe once we do talk about it every year, we'll be so much more educated and justified to actually be able to decide what we think is the best year. But I certainly think this became a different monster once we actually started talking about it. And while we haven't had to our idea a year yet that we think is like, oh, wow, mark this one on your calendars, that is one of the greatest years in gaming history. Yeah. Just a spoiler, I wouldn't be surprised if this one is. So, this series will progress, and as Toby and I talk more about it, this is certainly not how we idealized it. We thought maybe we would just talk about a few years and go, hey, 2007, 1997, 2011, whatever. Those are the greatest years in gaming history because the most good games came out that year. But it looks like this discussion's really grown up into, hey, let's talk about what was really going on that year, the state of gaming, the age of gaming, how it was growing up, and where it was at. And I think that's really fun to talk about too. There's nothing I love more than talking about video games, and I've been studying video game history for the last 15 years of my life. So to just be able to sit here and talk to you about this is real fun. And hopefully, I'm sorry if it was more me talking and it kind of changed into this different beast, but I hope you're enjoying yourselves. Sorry about that if you're not, but we'll keep having a good time if you are, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. Despite the fact that you talked a little more, you're very knowledgeable on this stuff. Like, I learned a lot of stuff myself that I didn't even know, so it's always fun to learn about new stuff about probably your favorite medium. So I'd like to think that with some of these later years that I'll have a little bit more to contribute. But I don't. Yeah. I would consider the last almost 2 hours. I would still consider it a fruitful, overall good discussion.
I think I'm not trying to speak for you, but I think you're probably only 5 or 6 years from being able to contribute more from your own personal gaming experience. Would you say?
I think I'd like to think that, but I guess we'll see when it comes along. But I mean, there's definitely a lot of like really great games still, even in some of these later years that I haven't played that I do want to get to eventually. But
I mean, truly, since we made this list ourselves beforehand, I do want to go into almost all of these games. I really do. Not all of them, but there's just so many good stuff here that I want to experience for myself and have my own idea of.
I mean, yeah, I have no problems with having this be like a longer series. Like, even if we spend like just one video on like a year or two, like I personally don't mind it. Like, I don't mind having like again, like this. I don't think this has to be like a quick series that we just finish through like quickly. Like we want to go a little more in depth.
No, I think it's more educational that way for both of us, and we get more out of it, and it's fun just to have these discussions. And now that we know what it is, we'll go into the next episode when we do this and have a better idea of it. And then that way, when we truly do, bracket out and make our decision on what we think are the true best years in gaming, I think we'll be more justified and have a more complete idea when we make that decision.
Yeah, and who knows? Like, I feel like I know we started out with just 8 in our bracket, but it could definitely expand from what we're seeing at this point. Like, who knows?
Yeah, I think this is great, and it's our channel to have these discussions on. So we just want to have fun with it. We're not trying to do anything that we're not going to have fun with. And I had a good time talking to you with this. So thanks for coming on, Toby.
Yeah, thank you for having me, I guess, and just sharing your screen and all this stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, hopefully I wasn't too formal. I'm trying not to be, but sometimes when we just talk about the history of video games, sometimes you just have to be detailed and go over everything that you know. So thank you again, and this is only the second video on Gamer Book Club, but hopefully this gives you an idea of what we're trying to do here is just be friends who talk about games and how much we love it, because these are truly discussions that we have. I mean, I used to live with Toby. These are discussions that we would just have sitting on the floor of our kitchen, just sitting there talking about games, and that's it. That is just what makes us happy, and that's what this outlet truly is for us. We're just some working boys who are just trying to enjoy what we really love and get our entertainment out of in our free time. So thank you, everybody. Do you have any closing remarks, Toby?
I would say you nailed it all pretty well. Look forward to having some more of these discussions, though. I mean, this doesn't have to be just us two. Who knows? Maybe we'll have more people on. Like, no promises, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. For now, absolutely us two. We're not going anywhere, but more to come. We'll see. But absolutely, we'll be talking about 1991 to 2022, and who even knows 2023. So
yeah.
We'll see you guys on the next video for the sub-series of Game of the Year by Year on Gamer Book Club. So see you guys. Thank you.
Yep, see you guys.
Yeah, Toby.